Hello, I'm Hazem Seeker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. In what's been a big week for global trade, we'll look at how the US is upending the rules of commerce and if free trade really is worth fighting for.
I'm Wayne Hay reporting from Vietnam, where we look at how this country has, in just a few decades, emerged from economic isolation and how it stands to benefit from a new multilateral trade deal.
Plus, a look at the futuristic self-driving vehicles from this year's Geneva Motor Show. Now, when the leader of the world's largest economy decides to take a more protectionist trade stance, raising the price of some imports, there's a domino effect. Even President Trump's watered-down tariffs on steel and aluminium hurt America's allies and trading partners, and economists are baffled. On this week's show, we'll look at why the United States under Trump is going down this road. We'll ask if China and intellectual property is Trump's next target, and if the world's largest economies start a trade war, what does it all mean for you and me? First off, John Hendren at the White House.
A defiant Donald Trump fulfilled a promise that helped make him president.
The American steel and aluminum industry has been ravaged by aggressive foreign trade practices. It's really an assault on our country.
Accusing China and other countries of dumping cheap steel on the U.S. market in an attack on American industry, he set punitive tariffs on foreign steel and aluminum.
Many of the countries that treat us the worst on trade and on military are our allies, as they like to call them. So we just want fairness.
The controversial plan would take effect in 15 days, exempting Canada and Mexico as they renegotiate the North American free trade deal with the U.S., and reserving the right to change the terms for other countries.
We're changing things.
Among the steelworkers that helped put Trump in the White House over his promises of protectionism,
we're going to bring steel back.
Trump had his own protectors.
We're going to spend over $100 million in our plant alone in Kentucky.
In Granite City, Illinois, hundreds of workers laid off when the U.S. steel plant closed 2 years ago will be going back to work. But on Capitol Hill, the plan was criticized as the first shot in a certain trade war.
I'm disappointed, is what I should say, because we just passed a tax bill, and this kind of flies in the face of that.
Democratic Senator Dick Durbin compared it to dropping a bomb on a flea. A fellow Republican, Senator Jeff Flake, vowed a bill to reverse the tariffs. In Canada, the foreign minister faced questions about whether the deck was being stacked against her free trade negotiation team. Her answer was diplomatic.
We think a win-win-win outcome for all three countries is absolutely possible. And at the negotiating table, we are absolutely defending and standing up for the national interest.
At the European Union, talk was much tougher.
We are now imposing tariffs on motorcycles, Harley-Davidson, on blue jeans, Levi's, on bourbon. We can also do stupid.
Newly planned EU tariffs on those and other U.S. products are designed to hit swing states in American elections, Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, that Trump's Republican Party will need to hold Congress in midterm elections later this year. Despite days of opposition, Trump remained a man of steel on tariffs.
Yes, I'm going to do.
Even if he needed a reminder to sign them.
Well, the European Union is the top trading partner of the United States in goods, and it is the top U.S. export market. Joining us now from London is Russell Jones, economist and partner at Llewellyn Consulting. Good to speak with you again. So why is Trump doing this, given that the Europeans have been warning for some time that they will retaliate?
It's a very good question. My suspicion is that this is an increasingly desperate president who is in a rather chaotic state of mind at the moment, searching out for policies that he can actually put into practice, which will appeal to his core domestic support. And protectionism is one of those policies. He doesn't actually need to have a great deal of support from Congress to put in place these initiatives. And he sees himself as fulfilling some of the promises he made during the election campaign. But generally speaking, I think it's a president who is searching out to demonstrate that he can actually deliver something of substance.
And how vulnerable is the US to European tariffs?
I think the real concern about this whole process is that we see rounds of retaliation and encounter retaliation and so on. I mean, the tariffs which have been announced thus far are in themselves really relatively small beer, especially now that the United States is thinking of carving out certain exceptions for other countries such as Canada and Mexico. In themselves, they're not going to create a lot of damage to the global economy or to the European economy. But the real concern is what follows subsequently. And now that the United States has decided to go down this path, whether it can stop, whether the world can stop, there are plenty of examples from history where trade wars, rather than as Mr. Trump has suggested, can be good things. Actually, trade wars can be extremely bad, extremely damaging for the world economy. So really, this, I think, is a misguided policy. And if there is one thing that I've learned over the course of my career, it is that bad policies tend to end with bad macroeconomic outcomes.
And you talked there about going down this road. So in the future, I mean, are we witnessing a sea change in how global trading rules are being used? Because Trump is using national security as a reason for this, for example. Would this set a worrying precedent?
Yes, I think it would. I mean, that mechanism is itself very questionable. But really, if you look at what Trump is suggesting, I think it's troubling on two levels. First of all, it is symbolic of the United States abandoning what has been a very multilateral, a very liberal attitude towards trade over the post-war period, so all the way back to 1945. It has been the multilateral liberal hegemon in the global economy. And by abandoning that role, it leaves a vacuum. And the question is how that vacuum will be filled. I think the European Union would like to think that it can occupy that vacuum, and then it will retain many of those liberal and multilateral priorities. But the danger is that it gets filled by other forces, not least those in China, where perhaps we can be less confident that the sort of trend that we've seen in international trade since 1945 is sustained. And on a second level, it's bad policy simply because it's economically illiterate. Trade balances are determined by macroeconomic forces, how much a country spends, how much a country saves, not by individual trade deals. And the fact is that for many decades, the United States has spent considerably more than it's saved. That's why it has an external deficit. And the sort of policies that Trump is pushing through in terms of tax cuts and deregulation will actually encourage that excessive expenditure to continue. So there's an incoherence, an inconsistency with what the US is trying to do in terms of domestic policy as well as this international angle.
So what would a transatlantic trade war look like then? And who's going to pay the bigger price, consumers or manufacturers?
At the end of the day, consumers will suffer, but so will industry. I mean, protection is a recipe for inefficiency. It's a recipe for less competition. It's a recipe for higher prices. It's a recipe for lower productivity. There aren't really very many things good which come out of it. Initially, perhaps you can sustain economic activity in certain sectors. I think that's what Trump is really trying to do. He's trying to protect the steel industry, for example. And you can achieve that end, but it's a very narrow end. The broader picture, which comes through over the longer term, is that consumers and businesses everywhere will typically suffer considerable costs if this process is allowed to gather momentum.
Russell Jones, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Well, joining us now via Skype from Washington is Jacob Kierkegaard, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Thanks very much for being with us. So your organization is involved in talking up the benefits of the global trading system. So tell us why free trade is worth fighting for.
Well, fundamentally, it's certainly correct that the Peterson Institute believes in the economic potential of globalization. We believe that you have free trade. It leads to more investment. It leads to more jobs, in fact, in some sectors. It leads to higher productivity and ultimately higher living standards. But and that is certainly worth fighting for. But what we must never forget, which we say consistently advocate as well, which has unfortunately been forgotten here in the United States in the last number of decades, is that when you do free trade agreements, there are going to be winners and losers from them. That is the nature of efficiency enhancing measures. But it is up to domestic policies to redistribute some of the gains, the overall bigger pie from a free trade agreement, making sure that parts of that additional wealth and economic benefit also flow towards those that lose from the free trade agreement. That has been forgotten here in the United States. It would be a pity if that wrong lesson from free trade agreements would be sort of imitated around the world.
And should organizations like the WTO be more upfront about that there are, as you say, winners and losers when it comes to free trade, that it has led to wage inequality and people losing out and so on? Should there be more acknowledgement and more attempts to deal with that?
You could say that this is something that, trade-specific WTO-like organizations should advocate. But quite frankly, that would mean the WTO and others taking positions on purely domestic policy issues, which I think would be resented in many countries. Ultimately, it is, in my opinion, incumbent upon the political leaders that strike free trade agreements and the backers that they have that want these free trade agreements for obvious, often selfish economic reasons, to recognize that there are losers from this process as well and ensure that these losers are indeed compensated in some way. So it, in my opinion, should really first and foremost be part of the domestic political process of agreeing to a free trade agreement.
Good to speak with you. Jacob Kirkegaard in Washington.
My pleasure.
Now, just as Donald Trump signed those trade tariffs in Chile, the ink was still drying on a revamped trade deal. The Trans-Pacific Partnership will get rid of tariffs for 11 countries and connect economies worth $10 trillion. One of the biggest winners is expected to be Vietnam.
The oldest porcelain factory in Vietnam hasn't changed much since it was opened in 1960. Back then it was operated by the communist government of the former North Vietnam when the country was divided. Today it's united under communist rule, but the government has embraced capitalism. Like most state-owned enterprises, this factory has been privatized and will soon move to a new purpose-built industrial park.
Moving to a new factory will help us develop. You can see all our machines are old, so we'll invest in more modern production lines.
For more than 20 years, Vietnam was torn apart by war. It ended in 1975 with the North defeating the South, which was backed by the United States. Communism emerged victorious, but the leaders soon realized that their centralized economic system had to change.
Economic reality was the best teacher.
The government embarked on a series of reforms to open the country up and allow market forces. It now has one of the best performing economies in the world. When Vietnam began reforming in 1986, its total trade was worth only $640 million a year. It was really only doing business with the likes of China and the former Soviet Union. Just over 30 years on, as its economic borders have opened, that figure has leapt to more than $420 billion. But some believe it could do even better and say the government must continue evolving to combat problems like rising inequality.
It's caused by corruption, illegal payment, and informal economy. And Vietnam must try to reduce it. And now Vietnam must create new incentive to modernize its economy.
The process is ongoing, and reforms like increasing efficiency and breaking down bureaucracy may be pushed along by trade deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Some may question the pace, but certainly the direction of the reform is very welcome. But some of that will need to be accelerated for the domestic private sector to be able to grow more than it has been so far.
That's certainly the goal of this company, which used to import its clay and export the finished products. Price fluctuations meant it eventually became a domestic supplier only. TPP and a new modern factory may allow it to realize its goal of returning to the international market.
All right, still to come on Counting the Cost.
I'm Sarah Khairat and we're at a recycling plant in Doha, and I'll be telling you why the Gulf crisis has been helping businesses like this one turn a new page.
But first, self-driving cars with no steering wheel. Its makers are hoping this is the future of transport. Just one of the new innovations on offer at the Geneva Auto Show this week. I caught up with the CEO of Icona and began by asking him about the concept car he brought to this year's event.
Today we are showing a car that is the after tomorrow. I mean, the next future, in the sense that the self-driving car represents the future of technology in the auto car industry. We believe in the self-driving cars as the future, because you can think of a car that through an app you can call and come and pick you up at your home and bring you to play golf or to work or whatever you want to go. And you don't have to be involved in driving because the car is doing itself.
I want to ask you about China. It has already become the world's biggest car market. Will China, for example, dominate Italy's electric car market in the next 10 years?
We have been, we opened the office in Shanghai in 2011, and immediately we showed an electric car because we thought at the time that all the Western world was in deep crisis because of the financial crisis that everybody remembers. Also, the car industry was in deep crisis. There were very few projects going on in Western Europe or in America, and the trend of the car makers were to internalize the projects, so they were doing that by themselves. At the same time, China was growing double-digit, so we decided to go there. We started with 5 persons. Today we are over 80, because as you know, that market is by far the larger car market in the world. Last year, the new cars that have been registered were over 28 million, and we believe that trend is going to continue. Now, the Chinese government has been the first one to really believe in electric cars for 4 reasons, that's my opinion at least. First of all, because they have the political power. There is nobody in the Western world that can decide the decision power they have. For example, if the mayor of a major city in China decide that the taxi or the garbage collection or the postage delivery has to be electrical, it's going to be electrical. Nobody can make that kind of decision in the Western world. Second, in order to finance this industry, you need a lot of money. And as you well know, in the Western world, we don't have that kind of money. Third reason is China is one of the largest world producer of lithium, and lithium is the raw material for the production of lithium batteries. And the fourth one is they have to solve the real pollution problem in the big cities. So they are the future of this industry as long as electric cars and self-driving cars are concerned.
Tereso Gigi Gaudio, thank you very much.
It'll be my pleasure. Thank you.
Now, a cautionary tale, perhaps, when it comes to the benefits of artificial intelligence. It sounds like a scene from a science fiction film, but news this week that Amazon's digital voice assistant, Alexa, has been laughing at its human owners. The smart home device has been breaking into spontaneous fits of creepy robot laughter, and it's got quite a few people stressed out. Amazon hasn't said how widespread the problem is, but assures users they are fixing it. Now, things are looking up for France's economy, but a skills shortage could put the brakes on growth. Natasha Butler reports.
In the French city of Grenoble, it's another busy day at this building materials supplier. Business is booming for the Samsey Group that has outlets across France. To keep growing, the company needs more staff, but it's struggling to find skilled workers.
We have 5,300 staff, but 216 job vacancies. We mainly need salespeople, forklift drivers and tilers. It's really hard to find people who are specialized in areas such as woodwork, so it's difficult for us to recruit staff with the skills we need.
The boss says that 20 years ago people joined young, trained on the job and worked their way up. But today that's rare because fewer people are attracted to industry.
We can't fill vacancies internally anymore, so we must recruit externally. But the skills we need are not always taught in training schools, so there's a lack of available talent. We train in-house, but it's not enough.
France is experiencing its biggest economic growth in 6 years, but nearly half of its manufacturing companies find it hard to recruit staff, even though unemployment is high. Experts say the labour shortage could slow growth.
There is no clear impediment for growth in the next few months, but the labour shortages can be a real drag for growth in the next few quarters.
The French government wants to fix the country's labour shortage and get more young people into work. It's already reformed the labour law, allowing the workplace to be more flexible, and it wants to boost the number of training and apprenticeship schemes like this one. Teachers at this school near Paris hope the government's focus on training will improve the image of apprenticeships and create more opportunities.
When a young person arrives at a company with 2 years of training like this, they are much more attractive, and it's what companies want.
I want to learn as much as possible here, then one day open my own company.
To what extent the government's reforms will ease the labour shortage won't be clear for a few years, but investing in this generation can only help the economy in the future. Natasha Butler for Counting the Cost, Roy Malmaison, France.
And finally, the International Monetary Fund says the economic impact of a 9-month blockade on Qatar is easing. Its latest figures show the Gulf crisis has actually helped the country to become more self-reliant. Sarah Khairat reports from Doha.
Out of a crisis comes opportunity, and for 23-year-old Abdullah, it's this: a new machine to make egg cartons made from recycled paper. It can produce as many as 100,000 of them a day, meaning Abdullah will be able to meet a boom in local egg production since the blockade.
After the Gulf crisis, we lost all our main customers, and because they are mainly from Saudi Arabia, Bahrain and UAE. But we never gave up on our business, and we continued searching another new way to run our factory.
Al Sawaidi owns the only paper recycling factory in Qatar, which has 4 times as many customers since the blockade started in June. And the factory exports 80% of its recycled paper to the likes of China, Sri Lanka and Oman, and plans on expanding.
Water is added to this and it's turned into pulp. It's then pressed and dried on this machine here. The whole process takes 30 seconds to end up with recycled paper. But the water used is also recycled, which means very little is wasted, costs are reduced, and the speed that it takes means the company can deliver its boost in orders since the blockade of this on time.
More than 3,000 new businesses have opened in Qatar since the Gulf crisis. Spurred on by a sense of national pride and a need to rely less on imports, the Emir of Qatar is keen to implement self-sufficiency as soon as possible.
We didn't actually feel the blockade, except the high prices of some raw materials.
The challenges of the blockade are continuing, but Qatar Development Bank says it has enough resources to support startups and entrepreneurs.
We take it from the idea stage up until access to funding and investment, access to markets, and how we can take them globally later on.
Back in the paper recycling factory, the owner says a lack of trees in Qatar helps teach the younger generation the importance of recycling and how the Gulf crisis has helped him turn the wheel of fortune from one man's trash to another man's treasure.
And that is our show for this week. Remember, you can get in touch with us by tweeting me at Hazem Seeker and use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online as well at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Hazem Seeker from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.